Hey guys, tonight we're gonna drift back about 1,000 years. So if you're settling into bed, maybe dim the lights a little. Get comfortable. Let the room get quiet. Because tonight we're following a group of famously loud, bearded people who sailed thousands of miles across the Atlantic, only to discover that the place they arrived at was already very much occupied. And as it turns out, the Vikings were not the only people who knew how to survive in a harsh land. So this is the slow, strange story of what happened when Norse explorers met the indigenous peoples of North America and what eventually became of those Vikings after the encounters. Now, the Vikings, as you probably know, were not exactly shy travelers. If there was a coastline somewhere in the North Atlantic, they were probably already halfway there. By the late 900s, Norse sailors had spread across an impressive chunk of the northern world. They had settled Iceland, they had built farms on the icy coast of Greenland, and they had turned long-distance ocean sailing into something that was, if not exactly safe, at least somewhat routine. This whole expansion was largely driven by one particular individual, a man who, quite honestly, might not have been the most trustworthy travel guide. His name was Eric the Red. And yes, that was probably not a nickname you received for having a calm personality and excellent conflict resolution skills. Eric the Red had originally been born in Norway, but he and his family had already been pushed westward once after his father was exiled for committing murder, which, if we're being honest, was a somewhat recurring theme in Viking society. Arguments sometimes escalated, axes sometimes appeared, and suddenly someone needed to relocate to an entirely new island. So Eric grew up in Iceland, which at the time was already a fairly rugged place to live. But Eric managed to make things even more complicated for himself, because he also got into a dispute, which, predictably, ended with several people dead. And once again, the local community decided the best solution was simple. Eric needed to leave. So around the year 982, Eric the Red sailed west into largely unknown waters, and after a long voyage across the cold Atlantic, he found something surprising: Greenland. Now, if you've ever seen Greenland on a map or looked at a photo, you might already suspect something about the name. It's not exactly green. But Eric was a clever marketer. He figured that if he called the place Greenland, future settlers might be slightly more enthusiastic about moving there, which is honestly one of the earliest known examples of real estate advertising. And somehow, it worked. Within a few years, several hundred Norse settlers followed Eric to Greenland. They built farms along the southwestern coast, they raised sheep, goats, and cattle, and they established small but surprisingly stable communities. Life there wasn't easy, but the Norse were used to that. The climate was harsh, the growing season was short, but the fjords provided decent grazing land, and the sea offered fish and seals. For a while, Greenland seemed like a success story. But the Norse settlers were also restless explorers, and eventually, someone decided to keep going west. That someone was Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson. Now, Leif had spent some time in Norway, where he had picked up Christianity, a few new sailing techniques, and probably a bit of curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon. Around the year 1000, Leif set out from Greenland with a small crew and a sturdy Viking longship. Their destination was a land rumored to exist even farther west. And eventually, after crossing the Labrador Sea, they began to see coastlines. Rocky shores, forests, rivers, and something that Greenland definitely did not have: trees. Lots of trees. For the Norse settlers in Greenland, timber was incredibly valuable. Their island had very few large forests, so discovering a land filled with wood would have been incredibly exciting. The Vikings explored several regions. They first encountered a rocky land they called Helgeland, which many historians believe was probably Baffin Island. Then they moved south to a wooded area they called Markland, likely Labrador, and eventually they reached a more temperate place, a place with wild grapes, mild weather, and grassy fields. The Vikings named it Vinland, which roughly translates to wineland or land of vines. And compared to Greenland, it must have felt almost luxurious. The weather was milder, the land was fertile, and the forests seemed endless. So naturally, the Vikings did what Vikings usually did. They decided to settle, at least for a while. Archaeologists today believe the Norse established a small settlement at a place we now call Meadows in modern Newfoundland. And if you visit the site today, you can still see the outlines of their turf houses, low wooden structures covered with thick sod roofs designed to keep out the wind and cold. It wasn't a huge colony, maybe a few dozen people, but it was the first known European presence in North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus, which is a pretty remarkable historical footnote. But there was one small detail the Vikings hadn't fully accounted for. They were not alone, because North America already had people living there. Indigenous communities had been thriving across the continent for thousands of years, and eventually, the Norse explorers started noticing signs of them. Tracks, smoke in the distance, small boats moving along the coastline. The Vikings gave these people a name. They called them Skraelings, which, depending on the translation, meant something like foreigners, or sometimes, less politely, weaklings. Now, this was probably a slight underestimation, because the people the Vikings encountered were highly skilled survivors. They understood the land, they knew the rivers, the hunting grounds, the migration patterns of animals, and they were already very comfortable living in this environment. Historians believe these groups may have included ancestors of the Beothuk, Inuit, or Dorset cultures. And at first, the encounters between the Vikings and these indigenous peoples were surprisingly cautious, almost polite. Which might sound unusual if your mental image of Vikings involves constant axe swinging. But early contact often began with curiosity. The Norse settlers traded goods, small pieces of red cloth, metal tools, milk products, and in return, they received animal pelts and other local resources. For a brief moment, it almost looked like these two very different cultures might find a way to coexist. But, of course, human history rarely stays peaceful for very long, because misunderstandings began to pile up. The Vikings were farmers and sailors. The indigenous communities they encountered often relied more heavily on hunting and seasonal movement. Their languages were completely different, their customs were unfamiliar, and occasionally something small would go wrong, a trade disagreement, a frightened animal, someone reaching for a weapon a little too quickly. And once that happened, things escalated. According to the Old Norse sagas, one particular incident involved a bull. Yes, a bull. Apparently, one of the Viking settlers had brought cattle with them, which already must have looked very strange to the local people. And at one point, a bull came charging out of the Norse settlement, snorting, stomping, making a tremendous amount of noise. The indigenous visitors, understandably, were startled. They fled the area, and when they returned later, they came back in much larger numbers, with weapons. From that point forward, relations became far more tense. Small skirmishes began to occur around the Vinland settlement. Nothing like massive battles, but enough to make life increasingly uncomfortable. The Norse population was tiny, maybe 60 to 100 people at most. Meanwhile, the surrounding indigenous communities were far more numerous and far more familiar with the landscape, every hunting trail, every river crossing, every hidden bay. So even though the Vikings were experienced fighters, they were also very far from home. And over time, the balance of power became clear.
The Norse simply didn't have enough people to maintain a permanent colony. They could defend themselves for a while, but they couldn't dominate the region, and they certainly couldn't replace the steady flow of supplies that Greenland barely provided in the first place. So after several years of uneasy encounters, the Vinland experiment slowly began to fade. The Vikings packed up their ships, loaded their timber, and sailed back east, back across the cold Atlantic, back to Greenland. But the story didn't really end there, because the question historians have always wondered is this: what happened to those Vikings after they returned? Did they ever try again? Did they continue trading with North America? Or did the encounters with indigenous peoples convince them that Vinland simply wasn't worth the trouble? Well, the answer is a little complicated. And strangely enough, the fate of those Greenland Vikings would become one of the quietest mysteries in medieval history. Because over the next few centuries, the Norse colonies in Greenland began to slowly disappear, and the reasons why are still being debated today. But that part of the story unfolds slowly, like most things in medieval history. So for now, just imagine those long ships turning back toward the east, the wind filling their square sails, the coastline of Vinland fading behind them. And somewhere along that distant shore, the indigenous communities watching the strange wooden ships disappear back into the fog, wondering if they would ever return again. And in a way, neither side could have guessed that this brief meeting, around the year 1000, would become one of the earliest chapters in a much longer story of contact between Europe and the Americas. A story that would unfold centuries later, in ways far larger and far more complicated. But for the Vikings themselves, the journey home was only the beginning of another slow historical puzzle, one involving isolation, changing climates, and a colony that would eventually vanish from the map almost entirely. And oddly enough, the people who might have understood the Arctic environment best were the very same groups the Vikings had once called Skraelings, which, in hindsight, was probably a miscalculation. But that realization took several generations to fully unfold. And as we drift a little further into this quiet medieval mystery, we'll slowly start to see how the fate of the Greenland Vikings became tangled with climate shifts, trade routes, and the steady resilience of the indigenous peoples who already knew how to live in the far north. But we'll get to that very slowly.
So the ships eventually turned east. The coastline of Vinland faded into mist, and the Norse crews pointed their longships back toward Greenland. The journey home would have taken weeks. Cold winds, long gray swells rolling across the Atlantic, the same ocean they had crossed before, only now the excitement of discovery had worn off a little. Instead, the sailors probably spent a lot of time thinking about the forests they had just left behind, about the strange people they had traded with and fought with, and about the uncomfortable realization that Vinland, despite all its resources, might never become a proper Norse colony. When the ships finally reached Greenland, the news must have spread quickly across the scattered settlements. Greenland at the time had two main Norse communities: the eastern settlement, which was actually in the southwest of Greenland, and the western settlement, located several hundred kilometers farther north. Between them, historians estimate there were perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 Norse settlers at their peak. Not a huge population, but large enough to build farms, churches, and a small but functioning society. The people who returned from Vinland would have had stories about endless forests, wild grapes, warmer weather, and of course, the Skraelings, the mysterious inhabitants who already lived there.
Now, for a while, these stories actually sparked more voyages. Vinland wasn't immediately abandoned in Norse imagination. In fact, several expeditions followed the first journeys of Leif Erikson. One of the most famous involved a man named Thorfinn Karlsefni. And if we're being honest, Thorfinn sounds exactly like the kind of name you would expect to hear in a Viking saga. Strong, confident, slightly dramatic. Karlsefni was a wealthy merchant from Iceland who heard about Finland and decided, naturally, that he should try to establish a real colony there, because why not attempt a transatlantic settlement project in the year 1010? What could possibly go wrong? So Thorfinn organized an expedition, and this wasn't a small exploration party. This time there were about 60 men and women, along with livestock, cows, sheep, probably a few very confused goats. The idea was simple. Unlike the earlier explorers, Karlsefni wanted to build a permanent settlement, a real colony, one that could farm the land and stay for generations. When they arrived in Vinland, things actually started fairly well. The land was fertile, the climate was manageable, and for a while, trade with the local indigenous groups continued. The sagas describe the Norse trading red cloth for animal pelts. Apparently, the bright red fabric was especially popular, which is interesting because the Vikings probably didn't realize they were introducing an entirely new kind of textile to the region. Metal goods were also valuable. Iron tools, knives, and small crafted objects. For indigenous hunters who relied heavily on stone tools, iron must have seemed incredibly useful. So for a brief moment, Vinland almost worked. People built houses, they gathered timber, they explored the coastline, and according to the sagas, one particularly important event even happened there. A baby was born. His name was Snorri Thorfinnsson, which might not sound dramatic, but it actually matters quite a bit, because Snorri is believed to be the first recorded child of European descent born in North America, about 5 centuries before Columbus. Of course, poor Snorri had absolutely no idea he was part of a historical milestone. He was probably just being a baby in a turf house surrounded by nervous Viking settlers. But the colony didn't last long, because eventually the same problems returned. The Skraelings came back. At first, they traded. Then tensions rose. The sagas describe larger groups of indigenous warriors approaching the Norse camp, sometimes with bows, sometimes simply observing, watching the newcomers, trying to understand who these strange people were and why they had arrived. One account mentions an unusual weapon used by the indigenous fighters, sling stones, thrown with remarkable speed and accuracy. The Vikings, who were used to swords and axes, apparently found this tactic quite surprising. And once again, small confrontations began to escalate. Nothing enormous, but enough to make the settlers uneasy. Karlsefni quickly realized something important. Even if the Norse were stronger in individual combat, they were vastly outnumbered, and the indigenous communities had one major advantage. They knew the land. They knew the forests. They knew every hidden route through the landscape. So the Norse colony slowly began to feel less like an opportunity and more like a risk. And eventually, Karlsefni made a decision that many leaders throughout history have quietly made. He decided it was time to leave. The Vinland settlement was abandoned. The ships were loaded again, and the colonists returned to Greenland. After that, voyages to Vinland became far less frequent. Some Norse sailors probably continued visiting Markland, the forested region of Labrador, to collect timber. Greenland needed wood badly. But large, permanent settlements in North America, those never truly took hold. So the Viking presence in the New World faded into something smaller, occasional voyages, fragments of memory, stories passed down through generations, and eventually those stories became sagas, written centuries later in Iceland, the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red. These texts preserved the strange tale of Vinland, though historians still debate how much of the stories are precise history and how much is embellished storytelling. But what's fascinating is that for centuries people thought Vinland might be entirely fictional, just another legendary Viking tale, until archaeologists discovered something remarkable in the 1960s. At the northern tip of Newfoundland, researchers uncovered the remains of a Norse settlement, turf houses,
Iron nails, forge remains, exactly the kind of structures described in the sagas. That site, Meadows, confirmed that the Vikings had indeed reached North America around the year 1000. And that discovery quietly changed our understanding of exploration history. But back in Greenland, the Norse settlers returned to their familiar routines: farming, fishing, raising livestock, trading walrus ivory with Europe. Life went on, for a while. Because although the Vinland experiment had failed, the Greenland colonies themselves still existed, and for several centuries they continued to survive on the very edge of the known world, which is honestly a pretty impressive achievement. Imagine living on a remote Arctic island, separated from Europe by weeks of dangerous ocean travel. Supplies were limited, winters were long, and yet the Norse communities managed to persist. They built churches, they had bishops, they traded with Norway. At their height, Greenland even had a small cathedral, which must have looked rather dramatic sitting there among the fjords and snowfields. But slowly, things began to change, almost imperceptibly at first. The climate began cooling. This period would later become known as the Little Ice Age. Sea ice started forming earlier in the year. Travel became more dangerous. Farming became harder. Crops failed more often, and the grazing land that supported the Norse livestock began shrinking. Meanwhile, another group was moving into Greenland, people who were already perfectly adapted to Arctic life, the Thule culture, ancestors of the modern Inuit. They arrived from the north, traveling with dog sleds, advanced harpoons, and a deep understanding of hunting marine animals, seals, walrus, whales. They could thrive in conditions that were becoming increasingly difficult for the Norse farmers. And eventually, these two cultures began to encounter each other, just like the Vikings had once encountered indigenous peoples in Vinland. But this time, the situation was different. The Norse weren't explorers anymore. They were the ones struggling to survive. Their farms depended heavily on European-style agriculture, cattle, sheep, hay fields, but the Arctic climate was becoming less forgiving. Meanwhile, the Thule hunters were masters of the environment. They traveled efficiently across sea ice. They hunted with remarkable skill, and they understood the rhythms of the far north far better than the Norse settlers ever had. For a while, the two groups probably kept their distance. There are very few written records describing their interactions, which makes the whole situation feel strangely quiet, almost mysterious. But we do know something interesting. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Norse and Inuit occasionally traded. Metal tools from Norse settlements have been found in Inuit sites, and Inuit hunting equipment has appeared in Norse ruins. So, despite cultural differences, there were moments of cooperation, small exchanges across two very different ways of life. But as the centuries passed, the Norse settlements in Greenland began shrinking. Farms were abandoned, trade ships from Europe became less frequent,
and by the early 1400s, the Western settlement had vanished entirely. No battles recorded, no dramatic last stand, just empty farms, silent churches, collapsed stone walls slowly sinking into the tundra. The eastern settlement held on longer, but eventually it too disappeared. The final written record from Greenland dates to the year 1408, a wedding held in a small stone church. After that, the Norse settlers fade from history. No letters, no ships returning to Norway, nothing. Which raises one of the most quietly haunting questions in medieval history. What actually happened to the Greenland Vikings? Did they starve? Did they migrate away? Did some of them join the Inuit communities? Historians still debate these possibilities, but one thing seems increasingly clear. The Norse colonies in Greenland likely didn't collapse in a sudden disaster. Instead, they faded away slowly, a gradual unraveling. And somewhere within that slow disappearance, the earlier encounters with indigenous peoples might have held an important lesson, because the Vikings, who had once traveled to Vinland, had already seen a different way of surviving in northern lands, a way based more on hunting, mobility, and adaptation. But the Norse Greenlanders never fully adapted those methods. They remained farmers, even as the climate turned against them. And sometimes in history, survival belongs to the people who adapt the fastest. Which brings us back, oddly enough, to those first meetings between Vikings and indigenous peoples on the shores of Vinland. Moments of curiosity, moments of trade, moments of conflict, and perhaps moments when two worlds briefly glimpsed each other's knowledge. But only one of those worlds would still be thriving in the Arctic centuries later. And as we drift further into the story, we'll start to look at the quiet clues left behind in abandoned Norse farms, Inuit oral traditions, and archaeological discoveries that might explain how the last Greenland Vikings finally disappeared from the map.